to chapter 10 on culture. And what you're going to find in this mini video is that there's some parts that are on the textbook, and then I include places that I've put up on Blackboard that has another set of cultural dimensions that's not included here. So one takeaway that I want you to know from this chapter is that culture is learned. It's passed down from generation to generation. And these are the parts that we learn as we grow up. So although this part is not in our textbook, other textbooks define it by learn shared symbols, language, values, and norms. So these are the seeds being planted in someone's head. When the textbook defines how culture is influenced by social constructionism, and it talks about the relationship for social, cultural, and political context, what that means is that none of this is innate. We're not born with it. We learn as we go. So that's what these pictures are of the under construction and by society. So the main focus that we have in our textbook is on the historical timeline, which is interesting because from all the books that I've used over the years, there was never a focus on these four. And I think that's something that's really interesting about the changing times, and there are some really neat historical parts that they give timelines for each one of these. I think what the textbook missed is leaving off some cultural dimensions and values that are often included in textbooks. So I have that on another slide, and I have extra information of that up on Blackboard. So the historical timeline that our textbook focuses on, I always help students remember by GRAS, even though we're leaving off the other S, GRAS. Because it's in no particular order, you can remember it by gender, race, ability, and sexual orientation and sexuality. In the textbook, they call it different things in different places, and that's why I have both of them on here. So when the textbook begins talking about race, it has some really interesting information that most people don't know on first glance. So for instance, that we share, everybody, 99.9% DNA. That race was actually not any kind of marker until 1500s colonialism, and especially with everything that's going on today, with all the different racial protests, with all the different focus on privilege, this gives a very interesting historical context of time and race. The next part that moves into gender, and here you can see a boy who's playing with dolls, a girl who's playing with trucks. You could think about it in terms of where we hear gender a lot, maybe even gender reveal parties. And again, this focus on social constructionism. So when people ask if someone is having a boy or a girl, and then everything that goes around with having to get a room ready, and the toys, and any kind of room we might paint, and the colors, all these kinds of things are all social constructions, which is very different than what the textbook talks about in terms of just sex, which is what we're born with in terms of physiologically. So gender is the social construct of masculine and feminine behaviors. When the textbook moves into sexual orientation and sexuality, they do such a great job of updating all information in terms of laws and then the historical context of LGBT. So the takeaway from this that you should know is, in general, in terms of who we're attracted to. And there's so many new terms today that the textbook can't possibly hit everything, whether it goes into even pansexual. So one of the things to keep in mind is, my guess is in a few years, the textbook is going to update it with even more words that we use for things. The takeaway from this part of the textbook is that it focuses a lot in terms of the words that we use and sexual orientation as opposed to preference, as if something is a choice. And then the last category that the textbook talks about in terms of timelines is about ability. And that could be in terms of body, or it could be in terms of mind. And it's interesting that they don't have the focus on the opposite part in terms of disability, but all these things go into the main categories of the timeline. So please make sure that you're familiar with all parts of it. They do have a small focus of religion and age and nationality and class that you're probably going to go into much more detail in, say, a sociology class. Now, on the last slide that we're going to move into is typically the emphasis of focus in a communication course. So since our textbook doesn't have it, I provide it on this last slide. So there's typically 5 cultural dimensions. Another word for that is values. And I added some notes on it in Blackboard. And part of it on 1, 2, and 3, 4 is Hofstede's model. And then the last one is on Hall. And those are 2 scholars' last names of Hofstede and Hall. So the very first one is on power distance. And this one is about hierarchies. So when you're reading through this all this material, you're going to find that a lot of it focuses on specific countries and cultures. You can also think about it in terms of our Blackboard discussion, even just in terms of different families or people that you know. So while all these, again, are cultures and countries, you can even think about it in different people and different contexts of your own life. So in terms of power distance, when we're talking about hierarchy and inequality versus quality, so for instance, here in the United States, we are very low power distance. So if somebody insults anybody in a political context, the truth is they're probably not going to be thrown off in jail the way that that might happen in other countries. So for instance, in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, there is a huge focus on higher power distance. And that's what you can see here in terms of the thrown and the levels versus the even. The second one that we're going to talk about is individualism versus collectivism. And this is much more about whose goals come first. So for instance, here in the United States, we are very much an individualistic culture. And what that means is not necessarily that we're selfish here, but in terms of goals, it's usually more focused on the I. And I give the example on golf for that. In terms of collectivism, it's much more focused on the group goals. So for instance, in lots of Latino cultures, it is much more focused on the group. So my example for this one is in terms of basketball. I think the rule is you can't take more than 3 steps without a considered traveling, and then you have to pass. So the focus on goals and I versus we. The third one is interesting in terms of masculine and femininity. In a lot of textbooks, the wording has changed and we call it achievement versus nurturing, and that's why I have the difference in red. The reason why I keep number 3 in terms of masculinity and femininity is that they don't always update those websites with the terms, and I didn't want there to be any confusion as you're reading through it. So for instance, here in the United States, we are very much considered a masculine or achievement culture. How do we know that? Think about how you've been asked what you want to be when you grow up, probably since you were barely even talking. As opposed to in lots of Latino cultures, the focus is much more on femininity and nurturing. Now, I want to be very clear. The reason why the terms have changed is because, especially if one of the values in, say, a feminine Latino culture is machismo, most men would never want to be considered by a word that they might prefer as masculine as opposed to feminine. So the reason why they changed the focus of achievement versus nurturing is, again, goes back to these dimensions and values. So for instance, if you might go to Spain or Italy, and you know that everything closed down for siesta, midday. All these focuses are much more on the relationship or everybody eating together. Think about if we're trying to get errands done here in the States and just different shops close down or banks close down during a lunch hour. All of these are the reasons that we talk about in terms of achievement versus nurturing. So this is that corporate ladder versus more on the relationships. Number 4 is about uncertainty avoidance. So when you look on the website that I hyperlinked in on Blackboard, one of the ways that it talks about it is how we deal with anxiety towards an ambiguous or unclear or unknown situation. So people who are high in uncertainty avoidance try to avoid it. And they give the example in terms of Greece, that is a very high uncertainty avoidance culture. The opposite is low uncertainty avoidance, and we talk about more of that in terms of the United States. So I use this in terms of a homonym, in terms of the meet, when you meet someone, get it, M-E-E-T versus M-E-A-T, and how we deal with those. So these are my flags and cultures, and that's the meet. And then the very last one, and this one moves into what Edward Hall talks about, of high context versus low context. And this is about how we give messages. So in high context cultures, which are usually considered more from Asian societies, so it might be Korea, Japan, and China, in high context, it is much more indirect, it is much more polite, people will avoid saying no, and the focus is much more on nonverbal and allowing people to save face so they're not embarrassed. In low context, like here in the United States, it is much more focused on the verbal, and what you say is what you get is what you mean. So a lot of times people think that the indirect or beating around the bush might be someone who's being sarcastic. But when we're talking about culture, in a high context culture, they would never be so sarcastic the way we might do it in the States or the way we might do that kind of humor. So a famous example that people have given in other textbooks is if someone from a high context society is knocking on the door of someone from a low context society. So maybe high context mom or dad from China knocks on the door of low context mom or dad and says, wow, your daughter plays such beautiful piano. And low context mom here from the States says, thank you so much. She's been practicing a lot. And high context mom or dad says, because we were trying to fall asleep last night, but we just heard this beautiful noise coming in through our bedroom window when we were trying to sleep. And low context mom says, I know. We really can't get her to stick with anything, but she really is on the ball with this. And high context mom or dad says, because even this morning when we were having coffee, we had to close the front door because this beautiful melody was coming in. And low context mom and dad hears compliments again, so they say thank you. And you're probably laughing at this part because here in the States, a lot of times people would be annoyed or they wouldn't even know their neighbors. They would just put a rude note on the door, or people joke around in class, they would just call the cops to get them to stop. So in high context, if they said it to another high context person, they would totally read between the lines. But in low context, it's much more about the verbal message. So what you hear is what you see is what you get. And that's why they think that they're being direct, and that's why they're saying thank you. So that's the director's chair. So what I have up on Blackboard is you'll take this test. It's not going to take very long at all to see what your numbers might be for how you fall high context versus low. And you might have heard about ethnocentrism before. Very often you'll hear about it in a sociology class. And ethnocentrism is when we think about one culture being superior to another's. And especially in a communication class, we never want to think about it that way. We want to feel and see the value in all. So that's what my map is for the world, on the globe, as opposed to the superiority. So this concludes both parts of the culture of what we were going to focus on, and I hope you have a great week.